Back in May or June, many of us were ready to just kind of send Ramón Urías onto the waiver wire. And now here in October, he seems like an irreplaceable piece of this Orioles team, even heading into 2025. We'll recap Ramón Urías' 2024 season coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast.
You are Locked On Orioles, your daily Baltimore Orioles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, Orioles fans. Today is Thursday, October 10th, 2024, and welcome back into the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Connor Newcomb, and coming up on today's episode, we will continue our Orioles 2024 player season review series. We talked about Colton Cowser on Tuesday and his season. We talked about Jordan Westburg on Wednesday and his 2024 campaign. And today we stick in the infield with Ramón Urías. Going to run down his 2024, which was probably the best offensive season of his career. We'll talk about what he did differently and how important it was that he got hot late in the year. We'll discuss how much it hurt this Orioles team when he went out with injury in September and try to figure out why has the defense kind of gone off a cliff since his Gold Glove season in 2022. But that's all coming up on this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast, which is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. Just place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Just visit FanDuel.com to get started today. So we continue on with our player review series for the 2024 season. And today we talk about Ramón Urías. If you missed the Cowser and Westburg episodes, those were earlier this week, and go back and check those out wherever you listen, or of course on the Locked On Orioles YouTube page where you can like, comment, and subscribe. Leave a 5-star rating and a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you consume the podcast. But let's jump into Ramón Urías, how we've been doing these season reviews, talk about what went right in the player's season, talk about what went wrong, and then we talk about the biggest storylines heading into the offseason and then into 2025 for each of these guys. So we begin with Ramón Urías and what went right for his season. Well, what went right was, you can make an argument here that, 2021 might have been better, but I'm going to make the argument that 2024 was the best offensive season of Ramón Urías' big league career. He played in 100 games for the Orioles this year, had 301 plate appearances, which wasn't the most. That was his fewest since 2021, but he had a 115 WRC plus, a 254 batting average, 322 on base, and a 423 slugging, 7.6% walk rate, 18.3% strikeout rate was by far the lowest of his career. He knocked 11 home runs, drove in 37 runs, had 9 doubles and a couple of triples to go along with it. And even surprisingly, with some very, very low sprint speed, Ramón Urías stole a base this season as well. Now, it's not like this offensive season knocked the cover off the rest of them. You kind of go back for Urías, 99 WRC plus last year, 106 in 2022, and 115 equaling this year back in 2021. So by that metric, you would say, okay, he matched his 2021. Well, I'm going to say because he hit 11 home runs versus 7, he kept this edge in more plate appearances in 2024 than he had for the O's in 2021. And he just struck out a whole lot less, put the ball in play more, gave his team a better chance at the dish. I'm going to give the slight edge to 2024 and call it his best offensive season. And you can also call it that because there were probably times in 2021, remember that was a really bad Orioles team that went 52 and 110. There were probably times during the year when Ramón Urías was the best hitter in the Orioles lineup, but it didn't really matter as much because the team was so terrible. You turn, however, to 24, and there was a chunk of this season where Ramón Urías was one of the best O's hitters, and there was a smaller chunk where he carried this offense. And I think that fact also puts 2024 over the edge. And quite literally, in July and August, after it was a tough start to the season for Urías, he certainly was not playing every day early in the year. Once Jackson Holliday was kind of demoted again, Urías was certainly in the lineup more, but he was never really an everyday player until later in the season. But he did struggle in that bench role. And then in July and August, he kind of just turned it on. Now, Holliday wasn't around for all of July, so it was a good shot there for Urías. And then in August was when Westberg was out, so Urías still had that starting spot. And he made the most of it for this Orioles team. In July and August combined, Ramón Urías had a 157 WRC plus. Remember, weighted runs created plus. It's got an all-encompassing offensive stat that takes into account park factors and all that good stuff, where 100 is league average. It brings together hitting for average, hitting for power, getting on base, all that good stuff. 157 is 57% better than league average in that stretch through July and August. He was the best Orioles hitter by WRC plus in that stretch. Quite frankly, he was the 23rd best hitter in Major League Baseball in that 2-month span. Now you're thinking, okay, kind of 23rd best hitter in baseball. Like, yeah, that's good. There's a lot of hitters in Major League Baseball, but it's not like he was top 10. Well, when you think about the fact that I'm not saying Gunnar Henderson or Adley Rutschman or Jordan Westberg or Anthony Santander was the best hit or 23rd best hitter. I'm talking about utility man Ramón Urías was the 23rd best hitter in baseball over a 2-month span. That is 1/3 of the season where he stayed as a top 25 hitter in the majors. That's how good he was for that stretch. He hit .291 in those 2 months. He walked over 12% of the time. His hard hit rate spiked up to 49.1% in that stretch. He was a dangerous bat at the bottom of the Orioles order during that time. And the other thing that really went well that I mentioned already, he kind of incredibly cut down his strikeout rate. When he had really his worst offensive season, that was last year for the Orioles, Urías was a below league average hitter for the first time, and he had a 25.5% strikeout rate, pretty similar to the high strikeout rate he had in 2021 as well. To cut that down to 18.3% this season, that is a really, really impressive strikeout cut for a guy that's not playing every day. And with strikeouts, I mean, seemingly still going up, if not at least staying the same in baseball, for him to cut them down that much, that was super impressive. Maybe the most impressive part of Urías' season. He saw a small bump in his walk rate, up from about 7% to about 8% this year. So you get a little bump in walk rate, a big cut in strikeout rate. You're just going to be more productive. And the other part was he struck out even less with runners in scoring position. We talked about how big an issue the Ks in those big spots were in the second half of the season for the Orioles. Well, he struck out 18% of the time all year. He struck out only 16% of the time with runners in scoring position. Only Ryan O'Hearn and Anthony Santander struck out less in those spots for the Orioles this year. And he kind of just continued to be. And it's something that I don't know if it's repeatable, because those runners in scoring position numbers can sometimes be random. It can be about sequencing. What's the difference with hitting with a runner on first versus a runner on second in terms of how you're going to really approach your at-bat on a day-to-day basis. Not a whole lot is truly going to change in those spots. But Urías had another great season in those positions. With runners in scoring position, he hit .290 with a 123 WRC plus, one of the best O's hitters there, and is a .291 now career big league hitter in those positions, which is really, really good over the span of 5 seasons. And now he's never, maybe only once been truly an everyday player, but we're talking about 1,500 plate appearances in his career now. And he continues to come up big in those big moments. And the other thing that was just kind of interesting about his offensive season is that he did it all without these kind of gaudy or even good-looking hard hit numbers. Something I talked about in the last 2 episodes with Colton Cowser and Jordan Westberg and their success this year. They make so much quality contact on the baseball, and that leads them to success. But Urías had a pretty similar, maybe like a 1 tick down from those two offensively this year without those hard hit numbers. And the funny thing is, for Urías, this is what I used to always get upset about in 2021 and 22, when Urías was at least expected to be at that point a bigger part of the Orioles offense. And he certainly was, specifically in 22 when his team started to get better. He was playing a Gold Glove third base and his offense was very up and down that season. I would get so upset with Ramón Urías because he used to hit the ball hard. You go back to 2021 and 22. I mean, he's got average exit velocities up near 90 miles an hour. He's got hard hit rates in that time, like 43 and 47%. Those are near the top of the league numbers. That is really, really good hard hit rates. And I'm looking at him and just going, this guy needs to be more productive. And specifically, I remember in 2021, we kind of finally got the full look there at Ramón Urías. He's hitting the ball so hard, he's just beating the ball into the ground. A 5.2 degree average launch angle is basically just an automatic grounder. It was kind of the Eloy Jimenez problem. Like, he hits it hard, but when you hit it into the ground every time, there's only so much a hard hit ground ball can do. At best, it's maybe a double down the line. Usually at best, it's a single, and that's it. You're not getting a lot of extra base hits, no matter how hard you hit it, when you beat the ball into the ground. And that's what Urías was doing, and I would get so upset with it. Now, he fixed it in 2022, but with it came a whole lot more strikeouts, and he ended up being a little more, he ended up being productive still, but didn't really take a step forward. Well, this year, those hard hit numbers kind of went away, and they really went away last year. I mean, he dropped from a 47% to a 38% hard hit rate from 22 to 23, and he stayed there 38.5% this year. But when you cut down the strikeouts, you put the ball in play a whole lot more, and you still get your average launch angle way up. It was 12.8 degrees on average this year, by far the highest of his big league career. If you're hitting the ball in the air and you're putting the ball in play and you're not really chasing out of the zone, which is something Urías did well this season too, well, you can get away without these gaudy hard hit numbers. And that's exactly what Urías did. Now, there's a limit to that when you're not hitting the ball hard. And that's why, despite all that, it was still just a 115 WRC plus. Wasn't anything close to like an all-star level hitter. But that's still a really productive big league player who, again, kind of carried this team for some stretches, which we'll get to later. And it was just so cool to see him find a different way to produce. He kind of reversed his trend of being a reverse splits guy. For his whole career, he'd hit better against righties. This year, he was both good against both, but hit much better against lefties, which made it kind of easier to fit him into the lineup, and maybe could make it easier for him to platoon with Jackson Holliday if that becomes something that happens in the infield next year. But either way, just really impressed with what Urías did after the slow start. He was awesome in the second half, great offensively, carried the team at times, just was a really, really crucial piece of this Orioles team. And that's the big thing. Like, we saw him struggle last year. We saw him struggle early this year. His defense was going downhill. And we were just like, why is Ramón Urías still here? He kind of proved us all wrong in the second half. He's a piece that this Orioles team is going to need, even if it's not an everyday role, even if he's a utility infielder. He's a piece that these guys need. But it wasn't all amazing for Ramón Urías this year, because one thing, he got injured. And he got injured when he was swinging his hottest bat, and it really hurt this O's offense. And the other thing was, where did that Gold Glove go at third base? We'll talk about those two things coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is brought to you by Prize Picks. What's Prize Picks? Well, it's really the best place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million members and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, Prize Picks has made daily fantasy sports accessible to all. Well, how do you play it? All you do is pick more or less on at least two players for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. You go over to Prize Picks, and I think the best part of it is, you can go into the MLB playoffs and pick your players. You can, the NHL started this week, NBA coming up soon. Of course, you get football on the weekends. You get so many Prize Picks lineups in there, and they take like a minute to put in. Like, it's so quick to go in there, pick your players, and just sit back and hope you can get some winnings. And really, a football Sunday could be kind of the best time for Prize Picks. But either way, you can download the app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, just download the Prize Picks app today and use code LOCKEDONMLB to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That is at Prize Picks. Run your game. And today's episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by Booking.com. Booking.com. Booking.yeah. You can explore those U.S. cities you always secretly wanted to learn more about, because with hotels, bed and breakfast, vacation rentals, resorts, and so much more on Booking.com, you might just find your perfect stay even in your baseball rival's city during the postseason. Now, we know the O's are out, So you're not traveling to see Orioles playoff games, but you can still travel to see some playoff baseball games. Maybe it's the time to go check out everything heating up in that Dodgers-Padres series this weekend. Maybe a flight out to the West Coast, maybe a nice hotel around the stadium, maybe to get back to LA for a potential Game 5. That all sounds like a pretty good time, and you can book it all at Booking.com, and you can kind of go incognito and still cheer on our buddy Manny Machado. The right stay can make you a fan of any U.S. city, even your baseball rivals. And you can do it all at Booking.com. Booking.yeah. So as we continue to discuss Ramón Urías' 2024 season, we flip it over to what went wrong for Urías this year. The first big thing is his defensive metrics continue to plummet. Now, we know the story for Urías kind of comes out of nowhere to win the American League Gold Glove at third base in 2022. Now, it wasn't his greatest offensive season that year, but the defense was fantastic at the hot corner that season. He was a StatCast fielding run value, which at this point, again, I still don't trust all the advanced stats in terms of defense, but fielding run value is probably the best at this point. He was at +6. That was one of the best third basemen in baseball. He won the Gold Glove. Then last year, not only did his offense take a dip, but the defense, at least metrically, fell apart. He went from +6 to -7 on his fielding run value at third base, and then followed it up with another -7 at third base this year. And I talked about it for the Jordan Westburg episode yesterday, where I was just like, I need kind of 3 full seasons of defensive metrics before I really start to look into them. Well, we now have more than 3 full seasons from Urías. What do we really have? We have 1 incredible season and 2 kind of terrible seasons. And it's like, what is going on with him at third base? If you set the minimum to 500 innings played at third base this year, by StatCast fielding run value, Ramón Urías was the second worst defensive third baseman in Major League Baseball. Only Christopher Morel, who when he was traded from the Cubs to the Rays, they basically took him away from any third base at all. Only Christopher Morel, and he was terrible, was worse at third base by that statistic this year than Ramón Urías. It's pretty surprising for a guy who won a Gold Glove 2 years ago. Now, by the eye test, I still think he looks fine at third base, but you can definitely tell he is not the player he was over there 2 years ago. You can see he's just not making all the plays that he used to. Now, he only played 16 innings at second base this year. He was basically at third base the whole year. Now, he did play just shy of 150 innings at second base last year, so a little more second base time. But with these struggles at third, now his metrics, you kind of throw him out the window at second base. They seem to be league average, but he hasn't played there a lot the last couple of years. But I think the move to second base should be more permanent for Ramón Urías. Jordan, we know Gunnar Henderson's an everyday player at shortstop. That's locked in. Jordan Westburg should be an everyday player. And as we talked about on yesterday's episode, he's better at third base. I just think he fits this team better. If he's better at third and Urías is worse at third, would it be better defensively? It kind of makes sense to play Jordan Westburg at third. And that would allow them to maybe, if they wanted to, if they needed to early in 2025, potentially platoon Ramón Urías and Jackson Holliday at second base to make sure Holliday's fully ready to go next year and maybe ease him back in a bit. I really don't know what to tell you for Urías. Like, it seems like the arm strength is still there. He still makes some of the really, really great plays. He still makes some of the Gold Glove level plays, but there's just some of the more routine plays that he just doesn't make as often as he did 2 years ago. Defense fluctuates sometimes more than any other stat. You'll see it go up and down, up and down. Hopefully there's an upcoming for Urías, but that was, I don't know why, but it was definitely not a positive for him. Now, we know the Orioles still trust him there. Brandon Hyde putting him out there at third base. They think that he is much closer to the level we saw in the Gold Glove year overall defensively, and I totally get that. Again, you can't fully trust these defensive metrics yet, but it's a little bit of a concern that it dipped that much in just the span of a year or two. And the other thing that really went wrong for Urías this year was he just got injured at the wrong time. He wasn't playing a lot early. That was mostly because he was buried a little bit on the roster and he was struggling. But, he came in, he got things going. I mentioned how good he was in July and August. And then there was an awkward play at third base at Coors Field on August 31st, ended up spraining his ankle coming out of the game, went on the IL, and did not return until September 22nd. Basically missed 3 weeks when he was out with that sprained ankle. It was nice that he came back at the end of the year and then was, in the playoff lineup for the Orioles for those 2 games as Jackson Holliday continued to struggle. And it was really important to get Urías back, especially with all the struggles with runners in scoring position. But the reason why I say he got hurt at the wrong time is that he was coming off of basically the best 2 weeks of his big league career. So we'll do August 16th through the 31st, through the game he got injured, basically a 2-week stretch there. In that stretch, Urías went 15 for 44. That is a 341 batting average with an 1139 OPS, 4 home runs, and a 217 WRC plus in that about 2-week stretch. And here is our stat of the year for Ramón Urías. We're going to do a stat of the year and a moment of the year for each player we review on these offseason episodes. And the stat of the year is that 217 WRC plus that Ramón Urías had in that about 2-week stretch from August 16th to the 31st, that hit made him the 4th best hitter in Major League Baseball in that span. Only Aaron Judge, Lawrence Butler, and Jarren Duran. You've got Aaron Judge, the MVP, Lawrence Butler, who completely broke onto the scene and was awesome in the second half, and Jarren Duran, who was the All-Star Game MVP this year. Those are the only 3 players in that, admittedly, half-month stretch that were better at the plate than Ramón Urías. So you talk about a bad time to get hurt. I can't think of a worse time to get hurt than when you're swinging the bat the best you have in your entire career. I think that's the only time Ramón Urías has had 4 home runs in a 2-week stretch was right there. And here's what made it worse. It wasn't just that Ramón Urías was producing. It's that no one else on the Orioles was. You want to talk about a guy carrying a team? You can say that when a guy's hitting the ball well, oh, he's carrying the offense. You dig into the stats in that stretch from August 16th through the 31st, Ramón Urías was quite literally carrying the team. I mentioned his 217 WRC plus. The next best Orioles hitter in that stretch was Cedric Mullins, who had exactly a 100 WRC plus, which meant he was league average exactly in that 2-week stretch, and he was the 2nd best Orioles hitter. Ramón Urías, in that stretch where he was awesome, was the only Orioles hitter who was even above league average in that stretch in the latter half of the month of August. That's how much Ramón Urías, a utility guy, was carrying this Orioles offense. It was kind of amazing to see. He was dragging them to wins at times. And that's what brings me to the moment of the year for Ramón Urías. It is during that stretch, August 27th at Dodger Stadium, game 1 of a big 3-game series on the West Coast between the O's and the Dodgers. And Ramón Urías, off our old friend Jack Flaherty, gets a hanging breaking ball and ropes a 2-run home run into the left field seats in the top of the 5th to flip the game. O's were trailing 2-1. That swing gave them a 3-2 lead. And that was a game where Cole Irvin started and came out of the game in the 5th inning. And somehow, some way, the Orioles bullpen came in and patched together 14 outs of scoreless ball to just hold on. And even though that homer was in the 5th, they held on and won that game 3-2. Now, they ended up losing the next 2 of the series, but that was a huge win at Dodger Stadium to kick off that series. And it was basically Ramón Urías with that homer willing them to that moment to win that game. He was carrying that team. And I think nothing more than those stats in that moment really show you that, hey, he certainly didn't carry the O's all year. But for that stretch, remember when the O's were really struggling as a team, you were kind of turning to Ramón Urías like, all right, let's get into the 6 or 7 hole when Urías is up. He's the guy who's going to produce here. And that's kind of what happened. It was crazy, but it really showed you in that stretch how much he means to this team. So now we end the season, and Ramón Urías certainly in a much better standing with this roster than we thought he would be even a year ago. So the question is now, okay, biggest storylines for Urías going into the offseason and then heading into next year. We'll get to that to finish off the show coming up next. But first, this episode of the Locked On Orioles podcast is also brought to you by FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. And listen, I know the Commanders look really good with Jaden Daniels out there, but you keep betting on the Ravens, they're going to find a way. They are going to find a way. They're going to find a way, it feels like. Lamar Jackson might find a way to win a 3rd MVP, and they're going to find a way to win a game. So whatever the spread is on the Ravens, maybe don't take all the gambling advice from me, but I'd throw it on the Baltimore Ravens right now. And you can do that at FanDuel.com. So to finish things up on reviewing Ramón Urías' 2024 season, let's talk about what is next for him. What are the biggest storylines for him in the offseason heading into next year? The first big question is, will the Orioles keep him around? And again, if you asked me this in the first half of the season, if you asked me this time last year after kind of a tough 2023, I would have said no. Like, it felt like his bat was falling apart. He had low bat speed. He wasn't hitting the ball hard. He wasn't producing. The defense was falling off a cliff. And it was just like, there's better guys as utility options. I would have easily said, oh yeah, 10 times out of 10, I would have said I'm keeping Jorge Mateo over Ramón Urías on this roster. Now that's a much more interesting conversation. And honestly, I think Urías has now taken the lead over Mateo if the Orioles had to choose one of the two to keep on this roster. He proved how important he is to the Orioles with what he did in the second half, even if eventually it is Westburg at third, Henderson at short, and Holliday at second pretty much every day. And Urías is mostly a utility infielder. He can fill in for guys with injuries if you need it and produce. He can play third base, shortstop, second base, first base, we've even seen from him. That makes him a good utility guy. He might be the slowest utility guy in baseball history. It's kind of weird to watch him run. He is very, very slow for a utility infielder, but everything else, especially if the defense can take a little bump, is pretty good. And listen, he's still cheap. He's not a free agent until after the 2026 season, so the Orioles would have 2 more years of Urías. And at MLB Trade Rumors, their arbitration estimate for what Urías would make next year is only $3.1 million for a good utility infielder. He is absolutely worth it to pay him $3.1 million to be back on this Orioles roster. And if the defense keeps tanking and the offense doesn't show up again, he could be somewhat expendable and you could replace him. But for now, you got to keep him on this team. I mean, another big question is, can he bring his defense back? Because even if he's producing better offensively, if the defense continues to move in the wrong direction, it's going to be tough to keep a utility guy who can't play his defensive positions. But I'm confident, maybe not the gold glove, but at least a good glove is still in there for Urías. The Orioles are confident that's in there. I'm confident that's in there. I think we'll see more of that next year. And I think the last big question is, will he be more than a utility player? I mentioned it. The Orioles' goal is, you have Westburg, Henderson, and Holliday pretty much every day around that infield. But even though I think you're feeling good about hopefully Westburg at third, Henderson at short every day going into the season, there's still questions about, when Jackson Holliday will be truly ready to take over an everyday role. I mean, he's still only going to be 21 years old. He's immensely talented, but it could take some more time. I would think Holliday will be on the opening day roster, but that doesn't mean he'll be an everyday player from the get-go. And if he's not, Ramón Urías is a perfect guy. Maybe it is a second base platoon because Urías showed that he hits lefties a little bit better now. You can start Urías against lefties. You can start Holliday against righties. You can play that out through the month of April and then kind of reevaluate from there to see how ready Holliday is or how well Urías is producing to put him in that role. And the thing is, yeah, I'm sure Urías would love to be an everyday player, but we're talking about the floor for him going into next year is the Orioles' main utility infielder. This time last year, we were talking about the floor for him was getting non-tendered or DFA'd before the 2024 season starts. So in terms of a stock up, it's not like he's rising exponentially, but he has certainly regained his meaning, his role, his stock on this Orioles team. And good for Ramón Urías to pull that off. And I think that platoon is something that can happen. Even if it doesn't, he's got a spot on this bench. He's an important player for this O's team. I mean, you could say this about a lot of guys that stepped in, but where would the O's be without Ramón Urías this year? That's what you want to have in your back pocket in case you need it in 2025 as well. But let me know in the comments here on YouTube, what do you think about Ramón Urías' role next year? Do you think there's any point that he's an everyday player? Do you think they could platoon him with Holliday? Do you think his roster spot is still in jeopardy going into Sarasota? I'd like to know that, so sound off in the YouTube comments. We most likely can't guarantee it because it's kind of a crazy week for me, but most likely are going to have one more episode coming up tomorrow on Friday to finish out the week. Probably, unless there's O's news, one more of these Orioles player season review episodes. But until then, I'm Connor Newcomb, and this has been the Locked On Orioles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.